this week we're going to be learning about spelling and spell checkers. So I want to give a quick intro to you to get hopefully excited about this week. So first of all, where does spelling come from? So there's a whole history of English spelling, which is particularly interesting. But there's a video on that, so I won't cover that. I just want to add there at the end to think about a little bit more spelling as where it's going in the future, what's its impact, and how might spell checkers, which is our other topic of this week, impact spelling in the future. So remember, this class is about language and computers and their impact on society. So how would spell checkers impact society? Another thing to keep in mind is that for most of the existence of writing in the English language, there really wasn't a standardized spelling. We've existed for much longer without this idea that spelling is a certain way of writing words. It's quite possible for humans to get along pretty well with writing. Even our most famous writer didn't really find it important to have a particular way to write his name. So humans are able to fill in the gap. We don't... Compared to computers, we're much smarter. And so when we see something that's spelled multiple ways, it turns out that, like I said, for most of English writing history, we didn't really care. We just filled in the gaps, we figured it out. Computers can't do that. So yes, there's at least apparently 80 different ways that William Shakespeare spelled his own name. And this was, our greatest writer of all time. So something to think about. Come back to that in a little bit. But just to keep that in mind, so then where does spelling come from? Where does this idea of standardized spelling come from, or this idea of spelling? Well, I find spelling and spell to be one of the most interesting words in the English language. So as the video on the history of English spelling that we'll talk about points out, English has a need for this idea of spelling more than at least most Indo-European languages because of our kind of screwed up history of writing. In fact, I don't know if there is another language in the world that has a word spell, like the equivalent of the word spelling that we have in English. That means to put the words or the letters of a word in a particular order, in the correct order. I'm not sure that it's needed to have that particular word, to have a word dedicated to that meaning in other languages, because their spelling is a bit easier. In fact, I know, for example, in Russian, the word that you would translate spell into Russian, how would you translate that word into Russian is basically correct writing. And that's the closest you can come to it. So spelling is an interesting word in English. So where did it come from? Just the word itself. Well, if you go back to Old and Middle English, we can trace it all the way back there. You're going to find a different meaning. And before we do that, just stop for a second and think. How many different meanings of the word spell can you come up with right now in English? Think about that for a second. Most people, when I ask them, can come up with 3 meanings. And one that they'll come up with is a spell in the sense of a time, like a drought, a spell of drought, or a famine spell, short or long period of time. And that is a word that is spelled the same as spell, but if you trace it back to the origins, it's actually from a different word, and it has no relation to the other meaning. So we're going to drop that one, even though it's spelled the same as spell. It's a different origin. But the other 2 meanings that people can come up with pretty quickly are related. They come from the same word. And the first one you may have come up with is spell in the sense of what we're talking about, to put the letters of a word in the correct order. And the other one you might have come up with is to spell, as in cast a spell, a magical charm, right? Well, that's not the original meaning of that word. The original meaning of the word spell in Old and Middle English was just to tell, to speak, to say, to command, a message, or to give a message, to communicate. That's what spell meant. But it included also to tell or speak or convey a message that would be a casting of a magical spell, or the reciting of a magical spell. And this well, you think about magic words even today. What do they have to? How do they have to be done? If you say the magic word, like abracadabra or sesame, what's the important element of those words? Not that they mean anything, right? But that they have to be said in the particular order. The correct word has to be said. You can't say open sunflower seed. You have to say open sesame. You have to say abracadabra in those particular order. So the casting of magical spells was something that had to be done in a particular way, in a particular order of the words and sounds. And those were done back in the day with the runes, the RUNE, the English runes, or the native runes before English really existed, even on the island of Great Britain, which was the writing system that existed before our borrowed Latin system. And they were used to cast spells, and they had to be written or carved, usually in a particular order, in order for them to have power. So you can see then how then this word spell eventually, especially as the history of English writing evolved as it did, split into what we now think of as two separate words, one meaning to read letter by letter or to write correctly and say the letters of a word in the correct order, and the other one meaning to a magical charm or to cast a magical charm, to put a spell on someone. But they actually come from the same origin. But there's actually a third place in which this ancient word spell still appears in modern English with a different connotation now for us, a very different connotation. And that is the word gospel. So there's three ways in which the original word spell appears in modern English. And that third one you may never have guessed, but that comes from, as you can see there, that it means God's spell, originally God's spell, or, right, God's message. So the gospel was just God's message. And when you watch the video about the screwed up history of English spelling, she'll talk briefly about how some historians think that Latin letters were brought by the missionaries because they liked them better, they were used to them, they were Latin missionaries. And so that probably is true. There's always a nuance of different reasons why people make their choices. But another idea of why we have Latin letters instead of the old Celtic runes for our writing system is that back when runes were being used, they weren't just associated with the religion of the Druids and the non-Christian religion. They were also elements of power because they were connected with the power of casting magic and having powers over people's spiritual states. And so it's possible that only elite, powerful people were able to use those runes. And so I like this other theory. I think it's probably a nuance of both of them, but I like this theory because I like to think of these missionaries were coming with this idea of God's message should be accessible to everyone, so let's do it in a writing system that isn't associated with power and only certain people can use, but something that everybody could use. And so as they were going around trying to bring God's spell to people, they also ended up bringing spelling to everyone, which I think is cool now. I think my 11-year-old self, who got knocked out of the school spelling bee on the word coyote, which I knew how to spell it, probably thought that was so cool. But now I think it's really interesting to think about the history of where this word comes from. I think it's one of the most interesting ones. Okay, that's a little rabbit trail. But just a little tidbit there for you. Why should we care about spelling? Why might we want to build spell checkers? Especially since we existed so long without any idea of standardized spelling. Well, it's easy to recognize and organize words, right? So now that more and more people read and write than did even in the day of William Shakespeare, how are you going to look up a word in the dictionary if it just can be spelled any old way? You won't know where it's going to land, and you won't be able to use these resources to your benefit as easily. In technology, one of the earliest things that machine learning and AI was able to do successfully was optical character recognition. This was done in the US Post Office, where they were able to recognize, well, numbers, not letters actually, but to automatically read the postal codes on people's envelopes. So that's what optical character recognition is, converting handwritten letters and numbers into Unicode. And it's much easier with all the variations of people's writing and misspellings. if the computer can say, oh, okay, I think it looks like these letters, but that combination of letters doesn't exist in the dictionary of this language, so more likely it's the one that's closest to it in the dictionary than what I think it looks like. So it can really help with the technology if there's standardized spelling, on top of course, making spell checkers something that works. Standard spelling makes reading and information in written form accessible to a broader audience across dialects. This is true even in languages that don't have spelling, though I guess like Chinese characters, but I guess maybe you could consider spelling, making sure all the right strokes are there. But in those meaning-based writing systems like Chinese, there's many languages in China. A lot of them are very closely related. They may not understand each other when they speak, but their grammar and the way that they put words in order is similar enough that they can actually use the same writing system because it's word-based or meaning-based rather than sound-based. And so their spelling, or the equivalent of their spelling, allows them to unite and communicate across actually different languages with one writing system. And of course, spelling makes a good impression on other people. It shows that you're educated, supposedly. And on the flip side, misspellings can cause misunderstandings. Spelling the wrong word can cause some embarrassment sometime. But with that in mind, I think there's two questions that might help you think about what you're going to learn this week in a broader picture, the kind of picture I'd like you to get from this class, beyond just the kind of detailed algorithms that we're going to be looking at. So the first one is, if English has a particular word for spelling, because of our spelling being rather more difficult than a lot of languages that do sound-based writing, what are spell checkers called in languages that don't have a word for spelling? And do they even need spell checkers? And if they do have them, not only what do they call them, but how do they actually use them? What do they help with? If they're writing, their writing matches how they speak more than in English. Possible topic for your final essay, perhaps. The other thing I want to bring to your attention is last week I was reading in a book about successful people who happen to have dyslexia. And one of them talked about how he struggles with reading, and he thought perhaps, well, reading, not just reading, but also writing, of course, and then pronunciation of words. And he's a professional person, I think maybe a lawyer who does a lot of talking and wants to look good, and to understand what wants other people to understand what he's saying. And so he thought, well, a spell checker might be able to help me. So he started typing in his best guess at how words were spelled. And he said, I can't tell you how many times I would type something in and the spell checker would return no spelling suggestions provided. I can't come up with anything. So the technology wasn't helping him. What I want to bring a connection to here is that one thing we're going to learn this week is about how you can learn about how people use something with language and then make engineering choices to based on that make your tool more usable for most people. So for example, what we know about studying people's spelling and spelling errors is that most people, when they're typing, if they make a spelling error, only make it within the first two letters of a word. And so if you want to have a really good spell checker, what we'll see and we'll look at in some detail this week and next week is that the spell checkers have to check your misspelling with every single possible word. It doesn't have that ability like we do to look at all the different spellings of William Shakespeare's name and just be like, oh yeah, generalize them and say, oh yeah, that's William Shakespeare. It has to go through and do calculations with every single word. It's just not smart enough to go from context. And if you do a calculation of your every misspelling to every word in the English dictionary, which I think there's like 2 million in the full Oxford English Dictionary, even if the calculations of one word against every other word takes a fraction of a second by a computer, if you have that many words to check, those fraction of seconds add up. And so you just try turning on the spell checker next time you're writing and just sit there for 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds before you use it to try to imitate what it's going to be like if you have to wait a little bit longer for a spell checker, and see how long that can be when you're sitting and staring at a screen. So people building technology can say, well, what are some things we can do to make the technology more useful based on what we know about most humans, and make it more efficient, so make it work faster, and still be 90% correct, maybe. And one thing you could decide to do is to only do the comparison of the first 2 or 3 letters of the misspelling to the words in the dictionary. And so that would calculate a lot faster than checking every letter. You could also shorten your dictionary to the most frequent words if you could, get on the internet, or just get a bunch of people together and figure out what are the top 100,000 or 200,000 words that people use, and greatly reduce that as well. And that's going to work for most people. But for the people who aren't in the normal, like people with dyslexia, if that seemingly just an engineering choice might affect the ability for technology to actually help them in a way that's beyond just a good impression, that actually could help them function and in society and be more successful. So those are the kind of connections I hope you make in this class, and the kind of questions that arise, or maybe the questions that should arise, which was the question that arose when I read this book, was, I've never seen, maybe you have, a option on any spell checker that said, if you have dyslexia, check this box. The tool might work a little bit slower, but it's more likely to help you. Does such a thing exist? Has anybody thought about building that? How would you build it if you wanted to? How would you go about knowing what would be needed to be different for somebody with dyslexia, so you have a spell checker that actually helps them? I don't know. Has anybody thought about this? Has anybody tried it? I don't know.